right, looks like it is 4:30, so we'll go ahead and get this started here. As you probably heard before, please use the chat function over on the side of the screen for any questions and answers, and we'll hold those questions till the end, and then we'll get those to the presenter to get those answers for you. And as always, the YouTube recording of this session will be live after the conference on the NCGIS YouTube channel. Today, this is the 4:30 session. I have Bill Schroyer, and he is going to present on the COVID-19 analytics for resource allocation in Wake County. So I'd like to introduce Bill, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, my name's Bill Schroyer. I'm a senior GIS analyst at Wake County for Long Range Planning Division. And I'm going to go through some of the analytics that we did for the COVID-19 response, and how we use this data to compare for a lot of equitable resources, and made sure that we had coverage in areas that were likely to be vulnerable. Our epi team, I work very close with our epidemiological team in this. And what I'm going to show you is just kind of a progression of the maps that we looked at and how we kind of moved through in order to make decisions. These are not all of the same date. They're different dates. I just assembled several different maps for display. I think Ben is going to share with you this story map link, so you can follow along and maybe even look at some of the maps that I have prepared that I may not have time to play around with. So the Wake County epidemiological team used a lot of different data. We made a lot of different maps. We got this data from the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. It's called NC-EDS. And we pulled that to understand both the testing and the case rates, and made sure that we had coverage and what was occurring throughout the county, as well as in a lot of our vulnerable communities. And we'll see some of that here in a second. So we started out with our typical kernel density rasters to try to get an idea of where the density of, in this case, was the positive cases, and where these were occurring. And we looked at those closely over several different dates over time. These were geocoded records, and allowed us to kind of sample the data throughout the county and get an idea of what was occurring. And then we also did the same thing with the testing to see if our distribution of testing facilities was actually reaching people that we needed to reach outside of the more densely populated areas. And you can kind of see on the map that the density of Wake County is reflected in the dark red areas. These are also a lot of the testing was occurring. We have the testing facilities for both the private testing and our free testing. And over time, and this has been pretty consistent, what we found is that most of the people within Wake County, now we have tested a lot of people outside of Wake County, but the ones within Wake County were traveling about on average 3.5 miles to a testing facility. So in order to de-identify this and use these maps appropriately, I do a lot of aggregation of maps up into the block group level. These are census geographies. We also have a lot of our information provided through our social equity atlas by block group. You can see that in this underlying map here, where we have the case bubbles at the time that this was collected and how they compare to the block groups, and the vulnerability in those block groups is identified in the underlying data. The darker areas are identified as more vulnerable in this case. So, looking at that was helpful, but we needed a little bit more analytics in order to isolate some of the areas. This is a lot of data to take on at once. So we got into some of the statistical methods, such as the GEDIS org GI star. and the cluster outlier, local Moran's I. Those models were used in order to kind of understand where the clustering was occurring. And what you see here is the testing hotspot. So we had the red areas was high testing, and the blue areas, which would be the other side of the tail on the bell curve, were the lower testing. It's also important to note, though, down here is again by block group. And the neat thing about census geographies is that the size of the block group also identifies the density, the population density, because there's a certain threshold to the size of the block groups as they've been created. So, you know, at first glance, this is a lot to look at, what's happening. What we're seeing is areas of high testing and low testing. So we tried to isolate that a little bit more with clustering cluster outliers, which identifies high, low, and low, high. And the way that that works is actually areas that we just saw in this blue are areas where we had low testing, but we had areas within that low testing neighborhoods, right, that actually had high testing. And then the opposite was true here, where we had high testing and then followed by neighboring areas that were identified as low testing. So it's a little bit difficult to visualize, especially for a lot of people who are non-spatial. They don't necessarily understand statistical neighborhoods. So we did get a little further into that, but I wanted to show you first that we compared these testing outliers to see if we were covering the testing in the vulnerable communities. So you can see here with the swipe map that we identified these outliers for low testing and high testing within 52 of our most vulnerable block groups in order to make some determination as to where we might need to locate additional testing facilities. And you can see that they align where we've selected them out and identified what is occurring within those vulnerable areas. So we looked at some of the confirmed cases. So these would be positive cases. And we start seeing an area where we had low positive in the blue. And then again, with the hotspot Geddes Ord GI star, we have some of the block groups that had some of the higher cases at that time period. A lot of the time periods we were using were 2-week, 10-day intervals, sometimes a month. But you know, as the cases progressed, we had to keep looking at different time frames and reflecting on those as we moved on. So one of the ways I kind of demonstrated for our folks was where our confirmed cluster outliers were in comparison to where our testing was. And these polygon symbols here, the hexagon symbols, are reflecting high case counts, kind of like our bubbles were earlier. And what you can see here in the high-low areas where we had low case counts, and these case counts in the hotspot area are reflective of being the high-low, where we have high areas next to the lower areas in the neighbors. And then conversely, we have lower case rates next to areas that we had higher case rates. And you can see that as a reflection on the, just like the hotspot was. So an additional comparison to see kind of what was going on with that, with the testing, you know, this was kind of done for the purpose of the people that we were in front of, the epidemiological team, to start gaining a better understanding of where to provide the resources and if they're being done within vulnerable communities, because we don't want to leave anybody out. And what you can see is a quick comparison here in that some of the areas we had high testing, which was the green bubbles, and low counts, and then otherwise we had high testing and higher counts as well. So that became something to look into. So we got into a little bit different analysis and tried to identify some trends and some emerging hotspots. This is a new tool set that we used out of Arc Pro. This was identifying the weekly trends. Now, this was this point in time that we identified that showed a downtrend in a lot of the greener areas. So during this period, which was towards the end of November into the December timeframe, this was kind of after a increase post Thanksgiving. We had areas that were on a downtrend in terms of the case count. This changed kind of frequently as we updated the maps about every 2 weeks. So we also looked at some other statistical analyses through this, and one being this K nearest neighbor, which was an emerging hotspot using the K nearest neighbor. And what we found here, if you can see this, let's blow that up, is that in this area, it isolated this area as an emerging hotspot. And we thought that was kind of curious because we also had a very responsive testing facility in that area, and we did some further investigation. So that map and that analysis led us to not so much resource allocation, but trying to understand what was actually occurring there. And what we discovered was that we had a lot of people getting retested. So they were, there was a little bit of a bias, I think, was in that area. And by doing that analysis, we've identified that for that period of time. And we found that people who were positive COVID-19 were getting retested regularly. So that was driving the numbers up, as well as just the total number of tests themselves. And that was a free testing facility, and it had a rapid response, a good turnover. So it was doing its job very effectively. However, what we saw there is that we were getting kind of a large hotspot in that area as it's considered the amount of testing that it was doing. We also got a little further into some other newer technology, which were the space-time cubes. And this kind of helped us look at a perspective of what was occurring, because again, you know, this was very rapid. We needed to look back at 2 weeks at the most. We kind of wanted to look at less than that, but this modeling only allows you to do 10 in intervals of 10, so 10 days in our case, and this was the 10 days between November and December. And we looked at these space-time cubes, which is kind of a new method. I don't know how this is going to respond. Let's see. There we go. So what we could see are areas in the red that were kind of being highlighted as they were becoming more of an emerging hotspot, and then areas in the blue were cooling off and becoming less of a hotspot in terms of the count of cases. Through, in this case, I believe it was 14 days. And then underneath that, what we can see again, because I aggregated the data by block group. So this area was the one we were just looking at by the nearest neighbor, where they had a higher incident of positive cases because they had a lot more testing and repetitive testing. So from there, we identified within those periods of time to see where we had emerging hotspots along the lines of the census block groups. And again, with the overall vulnerability, those areas, what we're trying to do is understand if there are emerging hotspots in vulnerable communities. And our vulnerable communities has several different characteristics. I've spoke about it several times before, and you're welcome to look at it off of wakegov.com under Planning Social Equity Atlas. And one of the characteristics that we've identified as vulnerable is an age dependency of 65 and over. So we were looking closely at that age as a vulnerable population for outbreaks. And it also allowed us to go even further and determine areas within the block groups that were maybe dense housing, maybe it was single family. Maybe we needed to locate some kind of commercial facility in order to put testing in. And as a matter of fact, what we did was we identified a lot of those areas based off of our testing and identified testing deserts. And we worked with the city of Raleigh's parks to provide, I think it was 4 or 5 testing facilities in and around Raleigh in vulnerable communities that we put the testing inside the Raleigh parks in order to make it more convenient and accessible to some of those vulnerable populations. So we've used these in several capacities. We identified a lot of the socioeconomic demographic conditions within those block groups as we moved through, and we continue to do that now. We are slowly transitioning into the vaccination. And again, it's kind of the same premise that we're looking at the block groups and census tracts through the state lens as well as our own in order to make sure that we have the best coverage possible for the response in Wake County. So that concludes my presentation. If anyone has any questions, I think I have some time. I'd be happy to answer them.
All right, great presentation, Bill. It's really interesting. Give it some time for the questions to catch up. Sorry, I had a little trouble with your link in the chat. Apparently the chat does not like links, but I piecemealed it together and got the pieces out there. So if they needed to combine those pieces, hopefully they were able to get to that story map. It's an interesting use of the story map interface to show that off.
Thank you. Yeah, well, we're testing it. We didn't know if it was going to work, and this is a new experience for most of us. So, you know, if they have to copy and paste the link, maybe it'll be able to show it. Sometimes, everybody out there, the browser makes a difference in your accessing story maps.
Yeah. Here's a question from Sam Feldstein. What are the most surprising results in your opinion?
Well, the most surprising was how we identified the repeated testing out of that one facility. We struggled with that a little bit at first to, you know, I mean, is it just because we're testing that we have these cases? What does it really mean? And then finding out that, you know, actually there's a lot of duplicate testing happening for the same people. So I think that was probably the biggest surprise that came out of being able to do this type of analysis.
Great. Diane Saunders has a question, says, thanks, Bill, very interesting. Do you have more details about analysis that you have planned using the locations of people who have received the vaccine?
So we're working on that right now. We are working with the state on that and our database folks, and we're finding duplications in records in that as well. That happens to be a function of data entry, which we often have issues with. And we're looking at different geographies now. So it appears as if we're going to have to approach that by census tract and by zip code. We're not exactly sure what that's going to look like just yet, but all of that is occurring, and we are documenting that, and we'll keep moving through and see what kind of resources we can provide.
Right. Question of my own. That time cube analysis looked pretty interesting. What was the process of getting that together and stood up into a 3D map like that?
So I'm using that out of Arc Pro, and it's part of the spatial tool, the statistical toolbox. And what I learned with that is you have to have 10, at minimum of 10 time dates, 10 dates in there. And then there is an assembly of creating kind of a lookup table. That's not the name of it, but it's something similar to that you can reference as you move through kind of the different statistical methods. And the final output is a space-time cube. So I just wanted to show you that in this case here, it shows a start date and an end date, And then I have these numbers geocoded so we could reference that back to the block group if we need. And then it gives us an idea of the count at that time interval. So it's not hard to set up, but it does require the proper procedures and working through the steps to do it.
Right, you have to think about it a little bit. Here's another question. Diane Saunders asked a follow-up to her first question. Was it employers requiring repeated testing of employees in the northeast part of the county?
I don't know. It's possible. We did do a lot of deduplication of the records, but we did have in some cases. I would guess it would be an employer related that was tested. One individual was tested 64 times out of one of our facilities. So, I mean, that one, I believe, was actually outside of the county, but that individual lived in the county. So their address was in the county, but their employer was outside of the county. So I don't know. That's hard to say. One other follow-up, Ben, about the space-time cubes. I think, if I remember correctly, when I'm doing this, I tried to do it on case rate, but that's a double precision field, and I think it required me to do it on a integer. So integer only to do that analysis. How are we doing? Any more questions? Oh, Ben dropped off. All right, well, I guess I'm either talking to myself or Ben dropped off. I'm not sure where he went. I'll give him another second. All right, well, don't see Ben. I don't know if anybody can hear me, but I'm going to sign off. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, you can reach me at Wake County or hit me up in this chat. Thank you.